DE Curragh, my name is James Nagle, welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany began the invasion of Poland. Months of diplomacy had failed, and for the second time in just over 20 years, Europe was at war. The following day, the 2nd of September, Dáil Éireann convened to rush through a constitutional amendment which would allow for the declaration of a state of emergency. War had seemed inevitable since Adolf Hitler withdrew from the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact in April, and Dáil Éireann was committed to Ireland remaining neutral in the coming conflict. Declaring a state of emergency would allow for the Fianna Fáil government to introduce legislation which would usually contravene the constitution. On the one hand, such legislation was essential for securing and maintaining Irish neutrality. On the other hand, however, it would bestow near dictatorial power on the government. The main opposition party, Fine Gael, backed Irish neutrality in the face of their identification with the Commonwealth. The successors of Cumann na Gael and those who had supported the Anglo-Irish Treaty during the Civil War, they favoured continued Commonwealth membership, while Fianna Fáil, made up of many of those who had opposed the treaty, had stopped attending meetings since 1932. There was considerable anti-British sentiment on the ground in Ireland at the time, and Fine Gael's support for neutrality prevented the country splitting into pro-German and pro-British camps. The amendment was debated only briefly before being passed in both houses of the Oireachtas and sent to the President for his signature. Immediately afterwards, Éamon de Valera rose and put forward the following motion: that Dáil Éireann hereby resolves that arising out of the armed conflict now taking place in Europe, a national emergency exists affecting the vital interests of the state. Following this motion, the Emergency Powers Bill was introduced, a far-reaching piece of legislation which gave considerable authority to the government. It allowed ministers to make emergency orders to regulate and control any supplies or services which were deemed essential to the state, to take possession of or use any land or property whatsoever, and to censor newspapers, radio broadcasts and communication by post or telegraph. It also allowed for the arrest without warrant of any non-national or any person suspected of being about to commit a crime. A future amendment would allow the government to arrest Irish citizens, which would be used to intern up to 2,000 members of the Irish Republican Army. There was considerable apprehension amongst the opposition regarding the powers that de Valera was asking for, especially those that allowed ministers to order an arrest. Men now sat in government who once sat in prison cells under the watch of those on the opposition benches. Born of a war of independence and a brutal civil war, Irish democracy was still young. In 1932, when Fianna Fáil came to power for the first time, TDs carried revolvers under their coats, fearing that the outgoing Cumann na Gael party would try to stage a military coup. Leaving office peacefully, they later merged with the Blueshirts, mostly former National Army soldiers, to form Fine Gael. There was still considerable distrust between these two parties, but also an understanding that these powers would be needed to preserve Irish neutrality. After a mammoth 14-hour session, the Emergency Powers Act was signed into law at 10 minutes to 5 on the morning of the 3rd of September. A few hours later, Britain and France formally declared war on Germany. Over the next 6 years, Ireland would face numerous challenges to its stability and to its neutrality. Germany drafted plans for the invasion of Ireland, while in the early years, Britain considered seizing a number of Irish ports and possibly overthrowing the government. The entry of the United States into the war brought further pressure on Irish neutrality, and US Ambassador to Ireland, David Gray, held séances with dead British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, who told him that Ireland was assisting Nazi Germany. Internal threats to the state were just as stark. In January of 1939, the Irish Republican Army, proclaiming themselves to be the legitimate government of Ireland, had declared war on Britain and began a bombing campaign which they would later coordinate with Nazi intelligence. Several members of An Garda Síochána would be killed in clashes with the IRA, while the full might of the Emergency Powers Act would be used against them, resulting in mass-scale internment and 6 volunteers being executed by the state. For most Irish people, the emergency meant hardship and deprivation. Rationing was introduced as supplies became scarce, and censorship was used not only to guard Irish neutrality, but also to suppress publications which went against the staunch Catholic views of the government. Tens of thousands of Irishmen would serve in the defence forces, prepared to repel any invasion, though some would desert to join the thousands of Irish serving in the Allied armies and fight in the major engagements of the Second World War. They would suffer discrimination on their return home and in many cases would never again speak of their experiences. The emergency was a major test of Irish democracy and a severe strain on the nation following the economic war of the mid-30s. Neutrality was an affirmation of Irish sovereignty, but it would also see Ireland isolated in the post-war years, having not shouldered the same burden as the founding members of the United Nations. Even though Ireland rendered invaluable service to the Allied cause throughout the war, it remained stubbornly committed to neutrality, de Valera even going so far as to visit the German ambassador in Dublin on the 2nd of May 1945 to offer his condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler. Today, modern Ireland continues to be shaped by the events of the emergency. It cemented Ireland's commitment to neutrality and would govern how we were perceived by the world at large for decades to come. Along with regular episodes covering the events of the Irish Revolution 100 years ago, I'll be looking at Emergency Ireland of 80 years ago and the actions of Irishmen and women at home and abroad. I'll look back over the events that led to the emergency, from the murder of a government minister in 1927 to Irish involvement on both sides of the Spanish Civil War, and examine why Ireland was so committed to a policy of neutrality. Please subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date with new episodes, and check out the social media links in the description, especially Twitter, which I update regularly with interesting items from Irish history. Accorda, thank you for joining me on The Irish Nation Lives. Slán go fóill.